What's up, everybody? It's Joseph, and I'm here to talk some Arizona Cardinals football with you again. Today we're going to talk about how I think the Arizona Cardinals are going to approach the first round of the NFL Draft. I love the NFL Draft. In fact, I kind of nerd out about it. I know what you're thinking. No, Joe, there's no way. You don't seem like a nerd. I've been a fan of the Cardinals since they moved to Arizona, and I've been watching the NFL draft since the early 90s. I'm in on the draft, all 3 days. Okay, maybe I kind of start to tune out a little bit, when we get to the 5th, 6th, or 7th round, but I read up on it afterwards. In this video, I'm going to talk about not only some of the players I think the Cardinals are going to target in the first round, but I'm also going to talk about how the Cardinals have historically approached the draft, especially the first round. The first thing you have to understand about Steve Keim when it comes to the draft is he does not like to draft for need. He likes to draft best player available. I know what you're thinking. Everybody says they draft best player available. Steve Keim has repeatedly said that you get into trouble when you draft for need. His approach towards filling roster needs starts with free agency. He signs serviceable players that they can go into the season with as starters if they need to. They do that so they don't have to go into the draft looking for starters. Instead, they try to find players who may not necessarily start right away, but instead have a good chance of becoming long-term contributors. So historically, Steve Keim does go into the draft looking to take the best player available. Now, you might be thinking, how can you say that considering his pretty questionable track record with first-round picks lately? Kyler Murray being an exception, and hopefully Isaiah Simmons being an exception. Jonathan Cooper, Josh Rosen, Robert Kimdiche, quite a few busts. Whether or not he got it right, the evidence does suggest he doesn't pick for need. On top of that, there's also an argument to be made that some of those players were busts because they were played out of position. Blake Murphy from SB Nation's Revenge of the Birds Cardinals blog has a great article about that. I'll be sure to link to that below. Whether they get the pick right or not, it does seem that the Cardinals don't reach for need. To illustrate this, I took a look at some of the recent first-round draft picks of the Cardinals, and I went to NFL.com and looked at the positions they identified as positions of need for the Cardinals in those drafts, and then compared that list to the players that the Cardinals took in the first round. In some years, those players do match some of the needs, but at least 3 of the last 7 first-round picks taken by the Arizona Cardinals were not listed amongst the top needs according to NFL.com. Now, this isn't a perfect measure, but it does at least illustrate that they're not consistently reaching for positions of need in the first round. They do often add depth to those positions or address those positions later in the draft, but I think the point stands that the Cardinals are not consistently trying to fill a starting role with the first-round pick. They're looking for players they think will be long-term solutions. Whether they get it right or not, that's another question. Now, when it comes to actually making the decision about who to pick, the way the Cardinals and most teams approach that is they tend to stack their board in certain tiers. They have certain players that they consider to be elite prospects and then a next tier. The specifics may vary from team to team, but they all do some version of this. The Cardinals are going to have a list of players that they think make sense at number 16. If one of those players is still on the board, they're going to take him. If they're all gone, the Cardinals might look to trade back, pick up some additional picks later in the draft, and get a player in that next tier that they probably would have taken at 16 if they were forced to pick anyway. Now, while Steve Keim does take a best player available approach, he has acknowledged that positional need does play some role in stacking the board. Whether that's a contradiction or not, I'll let you decide. The way this probably plays out a lot of the time is they let the positional need become the tiebreaker for those players that they generally consider to be in the same tier of player. So before I go into the actual players I think they're going to look at in the first round, let me start by identifying what I think are the positions the Cardinals need to address in this draft. Cornerback is clearly a position of need for this team. I think tight end is also a position where they need to add some depth. They need at least one more player in that running back room to go along with Chase Edmonds. They probably need to add a young, talented wide receiver, probably in the first couple rounds. And they also need a defensive tackle, probably a nose tackle, someone to fill the role that Corey Peters had for the last couple of years. As I look at some of the players I think the Cardinals might target in this draft, I'm going to divide them up into some different tiers. Now, this first tier is what I'm calling, if he's there, they are running the card to the podium. These are the players I don't expect to be there when the Cardinals pick at 16, but you never know. Players slide sometimes. This includes tight end Kyle Pitts from Florida. Now, he's probably going to be gone long before the Cardinals pick. Most evaluators have said he's the best tight end prospect they've evaluated in their career. Some have even suggested the Cardinals might trade up to try to get Pitts. That's an interesting thought. They don't have a lot of draft capital because of all their trades, so they'd be giving up future picks, but it'd be interesting to see. The next player is Patrick Surtain II, cornerback out of Alabama. He is considered to be the most pro-ready, fundamentally sound, solid cornerback prospect in the draft. He has a really high floor, but he doesn't necessarily have some of the same high-end traits that some of the other first-round cornerbacks have. So he may not necessarily have the same ceiling as some of the other prospects that we're going to talk about today, but he seems like the closest thing to a sure bet at cornerback. Now the next category I'm going to talk about, I call, there's a chance they slide to us. These are players for whom there's a more realistic chance that they'll be there at 16, but it's not a given. Many, if not all, of these players could be gone at 16, but they have a better chance of still being there than Pitts or Surtain. This tier includes both of the top wide receiver prospects out of Alabama, Jalen Waddle and Devontae Smith. Either one of them would be great. Waddle is more the elite athlete. Some people have compared him to Tyreek Hill, where Devontae Smith has been more productive, but most people expect both to be really great receivers at the NFL level. This tier also includes the next two cornerbacks on most people's board, J.C. Horn out of South Carolina and Caleb Farley out of Virginia Tech. Now, J.C. Horn is probably the one of these two that would go first. He's been very productive. He doesn't have the same floor as Surtain, but many think he has a higher ceiling in terms of his pure athletic abilities. Caleb Farley might have the highest ceiling of all of them, but he also has some injury concerns. And he sat out the last year, as many players did due to COVID. So Farley is the biggest boom or bust option of the top three cornerbacks. I also included Micah Parsons, the linebacker from Penn State, on this list. Inside linebacker isn't really a need for the Cardinals right now, but as we talked about before, Keim doesn't necessarily look at things in terms of who my needs are today. He looks at who are the players that are going to be stars or at least solid players for me in the next couple of years. So it wouldn't completely shock me if Keim took Parsons if he was the only one from this group still available, but admittedly I'm iffy on that. Now the next tier is what I call seems like the right spot. These are the players who should be available at 16, although yes, there's a chance someone does like them and take them earlier, but most mock drafts and most rankings seem to have these as players that are pretty likely to still be on the board. And these are players for whom it would probably not be a stretch to take them at 16. This list includes Christian Barmore, defensive tackle from Alabama. He could fill that nose tackle position they need. He's an elite run stopper, but he also has good pass rush moves. And he's generally viewed as the best interior defensive line prospect in the draft. The next player in this tier is Greg Newsome II, cornerback from Northwestern. Now, he's generally thought of as being in that next tier of cornerbacks, but a lot of people really like him, and it wouldn't be a shock if he goes earlier than most people think. The last player I have in this tier is Rashad Bateman, wide receiver from Minnesota. Bateman doesn't have elite speed, but he's a really great route runner, drawing comparisons to players like Keenan Allan. Now, if the Cardinals find themselves in the position where all the players they wanted to take at 16 are gone, and they decide to trade back, that would bring us to this next tier that I'm calling, I'm good with it, as long as they traded back to take him. Now, this tier is full of wide receivers. Elijah Moore from Ole Miss, Terrence Marshall Jr. from LSU, Rondale Moore from Purdue, Kadarius Toney from Florida. A lot of different types of receivers, some bigger, some faster. Not going to go into all of that here, but there's a lot of different options depending on which way the Cardinals want to go in terms of type of receiver. Now, one player that some people might wonder why I didn't include this list is cornerback Asante Samuel Jr. from Florida State. He's considered a really good cornerback prospect, but he has played primarily in the slot. And the Cardinals have Byron Murphy Jr. as their slot corner, and he's really good in that position. So they're more likely to take a different position here and maybe try to get a cornerback in the second round if Samuel's the only option at cornerback left for them. Thanks for watching my video. Be sure you hit that like button and subscribe so that you know when I post new content about the Arizona Cardinals.